Hey everyone, it's Laura Myers for CMS-Connected. I'm here with Tim Walters from the Content Advisory. He just finished giving us a brilliant discussion at the Kentico event in London about the GDPR from a business design approach. So I'd like to start by you giving us a brief overview of what data protection by design means.
Great, thanks, Laura. So data protection by design is in Article 25 of the GDPR. I believe that this is the first time that a major piece of legislation at the national level, or in this case the international level, has instituted data protection by design. It actually comes from, it was originated by a woman named Anne Kovokian, who was a privacy commissioner, I believe in Ontario, in Canada. And in the 1990s, she formulated the principles of what she called privacy by design. And it's exactly the same thing, but it's called data protection by design in the GDPR. And basically the notion is that in contradistinction to the normal development process, let's say, where privacy and data protection concerns are kind of an afterthought. They're added on after a piece of software or after a business process has been designed and created, and you give it to somebody to put the data protection icing on the cake after it's baked. And privacy by design, or data protection by design, insists that, as the title says, that privacy and data protection should be, as it were, baked in right from the outset. So it has to be from the very first thought about how you're going to conceive of a particular process, whether it's technical or a business process, what the aims of it are going to be, and so on and so forth. You should be also, from the very first moment, thinking about how it affects privacy, how it impacts data protection, and how you can minimize or alleviate those risks in the design process. And very importantly, you also need to document that you've done it. So if somebody comes and asks you to, did you practice data protection by design when creating this particular process? The answer cannot be yes. It has to be yes, and here's the documentation to prove that we did so.
And what's the responsibility of agencies to carry out this when the GDPR comes into effect?
Yeah. So, I mean, it can be varied in many ways, but I suppose there are some, or perhaps many, organizations, that is, companies and brands, that could adequately conduct data protection by design practices themselves. But I think that in many cases they're going to benefit from outside assistance. So Anne Kovokian herself, who originated privacy by design, stresses that this is it should be approached as a design thinking problem. And design thinking is a fairly established discipline. It's becoming more and more popular, but it's certainly something that has been practiced by designers and therefore by digital agencies much for a longer period of time and more intensely than it has been practiced in other kinds of companies that normally don't think about design and therefore don't necessarily think about design thinking. So if it's the case that a data protection by design challenge can best be addressed by design thinking approach, then you might very well want to approach an agency that has expertise in design thinking.
That's fantastic. Now, one of my personal favorite parts of the talk was how you took this idea of how the GDPR can really benefit marketers. That was fantastic, because I think people get a little bit scared of the GDPR, but I also think marketers might see themselves as a bit of a bubble. It doesn't really affect them when it massively does. So why don't you go into a few of those benefits for our audience so they can kind of understand your thought process on that?
Yeah. So you're right on both sides. I mean, to start with the impact or the negative effect on marketers, it's not emphasized often enough that marketers need to be very, very aware of what's going on here. And for example, when surveys are done among companies about what is the level of attention to the GDPR and how much budget do you intend to allocate to it, when you drill down in those surveys, very often they are talking only to data security professionals or data governance professionals, which is a very, very important part of the GDPR response. But if they're not even talking to the marketers, then they aren't beginning to understand what the impact is going to be on the firms. and what level of effort, and that is to say what level of budget and resources are going to be necessary in order to address it. So one, marketers should just kind of wake up to the fact that it significantly disrupts the way in which they've gone about doing business. Because we've finally become somewhat successful at using data and a lot of personal data in order to inform and fuel digital marketing practices. And the GDPR now places significant new restrictions on the ways in which you can collect and process personal data. So that obviously is going to have that kind of a braking effect, slowing down some of the momentum behind digital marketing efforts. But you're quite right. They should also look at it from the positive aspects of it. And the entire notion, I mean, what I think of as the core principle of the GDPR is stated very early in the regulation. And it's in one of the early recitals. It seems like it's just kind of a throwaway phrase, but it says basically people should be in control of their own personal data. And imagine what happens, how marketing is transformed if marketers take that proposition really seriously and really embrace it and really ensure that their marketing practices reflect the respect for people's personal data and the fact that they ought to remain in control of their personal data. Yes, that's going to disrupt a lot of our current marketing practices, which treat personal data with, put it mildly, a cavalier attitude. But once you do figure out how to institute those processes, and again by data protection by design and other strategies, then you're in a position to create genuinely trust-based relationships with customers and prospects. So now you're talking to people, you're not trying to entice them and push them and move them reluctantly to the next stage of the sales funnel or something like that, but you're engaged with people from the outset who have made a conscious decision to be engaged with you. They've said, yes, I am going to give you consent to use my personal data because you've convinced me, or at least I'm hoping that you will carry out your promises to benefit me by the use of my personal data. So you can really begin to get into exchanges where there's a mutual benefit of good on one way or another, whether it's the ability to be confident that you're going to be treated correctly by the marketers, for example, by the company, that you're going to consistently get the benefits that are promised, and so forth. So that fundamentally transforms the way in which marketers can begin to think about their jobs, rather than feeding the top of the funnel by whatever means necessary with whatever leads you can possibly find. It creates something that's much more like a consistent kind of exchange between engaged consumers and buyers.
And that brings to mind the point you made about innovating within or inspired by the GDPR versus innovating around it.
Yeah, exactly. They really, it's sometimes hard to believe, especially for Americans, that the EU regulators, these bureaucrats, really think that they're doing something that's business positive and actually is going to promote business activity, but they genuinely do believe it, because they want to encourage innovation in the so-called personal data economy. They want companies to be able to use personal data, but they want to and have to, according to the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, they have to ensure that that personal data is used in a way that respects the privacy and data protection rights of the EU residents.
Well, that's fantastic. So thank you so much for speaking with me.
Great, my pleasure.
Perfect.